If I don't want to say it, I'm not going to say it. Good afternoon, friends. Today, I want to tell you guys about an ethno-religious group that I bet most of you have never heard of before, although you are probably familiar with their prophet. They're called the Mandaeans, and they're the cult of John the Baptist that have probably existed since the time of Jesus. Before we get started, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, like the video, and comment on the video for the sake of the algorithm. I want to talk briefly about the historical John the Baptist. John the Baptist really lived, and he most likely lived at the same time as Jesus of Nazareth. In fact, reliable historical records indicate that John most likely baptized Jesus earlier in Jesus' career of preaching his view of the Judaic religion. In fact, what appears to have happened is that John and Jesus were both somehow revivers of the Jewish religion, as often happened in Jewish history. They lived contemporarily to each other, and it seems that earlier in Jesus' life, he may have followed John in some way, at least in order to get baptized, because baptism was a ritual that we don't know to be associated with anybody but John. So Jesus was baptized by John, but after he was baptized by John, he sort of separated from him and developed his own followership. That of course ended in a violent end for himself. But Jesus' cult was very powerful and grew dramatically after Jesus' lifetime, particularly after his lifetime. Whereas John the Baptist's cult fell into some sort of obscurity. Many people around the world don't know that there's a religion that does not accept Jesus Christ, but accepts all of the former prophets of the Judaic religion, ending with the final prophet, John the Baptist. Sounds sort of similar like Islam, where Islam accepts John, accepts Jesus, but then ends the final prophet with Muhammad. I think this subject will be interesting for you guys because I believe most of you have probably had some influence from the Abrahamic religions. And it's interesting here to discover that there is another currently existing Abrahamic religion that has a different interpretation of a lot of the things to do with the Abrahamic religions that we probably never heard of, and most likely you've never heard of from your religions in particular. So let's learn about the Mandaean religion and people, beginning with what they believe in, which is what we call in Islam aqidah, the belief system. The Mandaeans' belief system could be considered Gnostic and dualistic. They believe there are three worlds: the middle world, the dark world underneath it, and the light world above. They believe that their God, who they call Al-Hayy, which means the living, lives in the center of the light world, that's the northernmost world, and is surrounded by malaika, which are angels, and he sits on a throne called the Ashkanta. The Mandaeans believe that the southernmost point of the light world contains a gate called Abathar, guarded by an angel, and they believe that the gate Abathar faces the North Star as viewed from the world, from the middle world where we live. The Mandaeans believe that just south of Abathar, the gate to the light world, lies the middle world, where humans live and where the stars and the moon and animals live. They believe that there are 7 strata within the middle world, and the lowest strata is where the earth is and where we live. And they believe that the ground that we walk on literally separates the middle world from the dark world. The Mandaeans also believe that the dark world underneath the earth, south of the earth, also has 7 substrata, each ruled by a demonic chieftain, ruling underneath the mother of darkness called Ruha and her son Ur. The Mandaeans believe that their god, Al-Hayy, defeated the mother of darkness, Ruha, and Ur, and the other demonic chieftains at the beginning of time, but that they can still influence us and disturb us in our present day. There are 3 interesting consequences of this belief system, or aqidah, or theology. One is that this cosmology implies the flatness of the earth. The second is that the Mandaeans distinguish between the material and immaterial world. They believe that the light world and the dark world contain beings that are not physically material like us. They're sort of spirits of some kind. And third, as these immaterial beings, particularly from the dark world, are able to influence us in our own lives, the Mandaeans believe in magic. And the subject of magic is discussed frequently in their literature. The Mandaeans follow the Jewish tradition of ascribing to their god a line of Jewish prophets. But unlike the Jews, they also accept John the Baptist, called Yahya Yohanna, as their prophet. And unlike the Christians and the Muslims, they consider him the final prophet of God. The Mandaean religion particularly venerates the prophets Noah and Shem among the Jewish prophets, although it also references 2 prophets that are not found in either the Jewish or Christian or even Islamic traditions. These mysterious prophets are called Shurbai and Shurhabil, and only appear in the Mandaean religion. Overall, the Mandaeans believe themselves to be the followers of John the Baptist, who lived contemporarily to Jesus Christ. They believe they followed him for the last 2,000 years, refusing to follow Jesus' teachings and separating themselves from the cult of Jesus. The Mandaean religious texts are written in a language called Mandaic, which is an Eastern Middle Aramaic Semitic language that is a cousin of Hebrew and Arabic. They have 2 important religious texts. One is Genza Rabba, which is thought to be written by the prophet Adam, the first human. And the second is إدراسة Yahya, which is thought to be written by John. Yahya is John in Arabic and also apparently in Mandaean. By the way, that's an interesting side note, right? I just said that the Arabic word for John is Yahya, and it's also the Mandaic word for John. Doesn't that sound weird? Don't you think of John to be such an English name or Western name? Man, it's not. It's a Semitic name. So is James. He was the brother of Jesus. By the way, that's why it became so popular, the name James. So is Joseph, of course. That's Yusuf. These are all Semitic names, interestingly. I was surprised to realize this in the last couple of years, that so many of the Western names that I considered to be so associated with Western culture are actually Semitic names and Jewish names. There's a third religious text called the Haran Gwaita, which is where the fabled history of the Mandaeans is contained. Western scholars of the Mandaean religion have long sought to determine the historical chronological order of these religious texts, and one of the ways that they try to do this is by tracing the various names of God contained in the religious texts. So for example, the scholar Kurt Rudolph believes that Hayy is the oldest name. However, there are other scholars like Wilhelm Brandt that believe that Mana is the eldest name. Western Mandaean scholars have been particularly interested in what the original version of the Mandaean religion was, because it has been long thought to be some kind of early proto-Christian religion. For example, Reitzenstein, an early 20th century Mandaean scholar, believed that a portion of the New Testament, particularly the Gospel of John, was written as a rebuttal to the Mandaean religion, while other scholars like Bultmann considered it to be a confirmation of the validity of the Mandaean religion. Other than its relation to Christianity, scholars have also been interested in the original form of Mandaeanism because it is quite curious at the moment. The Mandaean religion is not inclusive. They don't preach to other people, and it's very ritual based and governed by a priestly class. Whereas scholars believe that it was originally a religion that was inclusive, preached to other people, and was spiritually motivated as opposed to ritually governed. If you compare the three known Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, you'll find that Judaism is the most ritual based, while Christianity is the least. Christianity may be in general the most spiritual, followed or with Islam, whereas Orthodox Judaism at least is comparatively less spiritual than Islam and Christianity, most would agree. Mandaeanism is even less spiritual than Judaism and even more focused on ritual as opposed to spirituality. So since the Mandaean religion is ritual based, what do they exactly do other than have this belief system of a middle world, a dark world, and a light world, and the duality of material beings and non-material beings? What does their religion entail? As a consequence of the Mandaean cosmology, in which they believe humans live on the edge of the middle world, bordering the dark world, they believe that humans are close to the dark world physically and need to purify themselves often. They believe that what's called Maya Hayy, which means living water in Arabic, but they regard it as running water in general. They believe that running water, like rivers and streams, come from the light world. And consequently, they believe that they can purify themselves only with that running water of rivers and so on. In the case of encountering blood, urine, feces, or wastewater, Mandaeans believe that they can purify themselves using regular ablution in a river. However, in the case that a Mandaean menstruates, encounters semen or ejaculates, or touches a dead corpse, they must essentially perform a bath in river water to purify themselves. So essentially they have two kinds of ablution. One is total body and one is part of the body, and both are in rivers. However, whether they have to do the total amount depends on whether they've basically done something involving menstruation or sex, or touching a dead corpse, being around death. And it's interesting, this is a little bit similar to Islam. Islam also has something called wudu, which is a kind of ritual ablution that they do for similar reasons before prayers. And in Islam, after somebody has sex or touches ejaculate, they also have to shower. But in Islam, they don't have to get in river water, they just shower with regular water. For these people, the Mandaeans, river water is extremely important. But there are a couple of differences between how the Mandaeans regard ritual impurity and how Muslims regard it. So for example, the Mandaeans believe that nazil, this early stage of ritual impurity, is transferable to other people with touch. So when people are in that state of being, they can't touch anybody until they go to a river and commit ritual ablution. Moreover, the Mandaeans believe that they can transfer this state of ritual impurity, nazil, into materials. Specifically that natural materials like wood, for example, are resistant to it, but that unnatural materials like man-made materials are not resistant to it and can receive the state of impurity from the human. The second state of ritual impurity can only be cured with John the Baptist's baptism, and it happens during the first week of a marriage and during the first month after a mother has a child. The Mandaeans' baptism is called masveta. It's performed in the presence of other Mandaeans that wear a costume called rasta, which is all white. Interestingly, by the way, in Islam, the color white is preferred, and the Prophet Muhammad, who many of you have been asking to say sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which by the way, is not mandatory in Islam. It's not. You don't have to say that about the Prophet Muhammad. So please stop bothering me and trying to tell me to say sallallahu alayhi wasallam. If I don't want to say it, I'm not going to say it. Prophet Muhammad didn't say I have to say it. You only have to say it in prayer. So sorry, I got a little bit upset, but for all you Muslims that keep saying you don't say sallallahu alayhi wasallam, it's none of your freaking business. The reason I'm not saying it is to not make the video more confusing to a Western audience. Look at these, I mean, some of you guys are really ridiculous. Anyway, the Prophet Muhammad both preferred to wear white and said it was the best of colors, and in the descriptions of the Prophet's encounters with immaterial angels, which some people couldn't see, they're noted to have been wearing fully white clothing. So it's interesting that these religions share some things in common. I don't think that the Mandaeans received this from Islam. I think it's something that they had in common from their origins or from an earlier time period. While Mandaeans are in a state of sulta, they're shunned and encouraged not to interact with other Mandaeans until they can complete their baptism. The Mandaeans perform two kinds of ablution in running water: tamasha and rashama. Tamasha is performed to cure the state of nazil, that impure state when someone encounters these different bodily fluids and so on. Rashama is performed just before each of their 3 daily prayers. The prayers are very ritualized, in which they go through a series of motions and pronounce memorized literature. It's not very spiritual. It just, the 3 prayers sort of form another part of their daily rituals. Baptisms, the most distinct ritual in the Mandaean religion, are required to end the impure states of sulta. So therefore, they're done twice before marriage, once after marriage. They have to be done at least once in their lifetimes. But they're also done on their high holy days, including John the Baptist's alleged birthday, called Dahwa Dimane, and a 5-day holy period, which is called Panja. The initiation into priesthood, called Idrasa at-Taqa, requires several baptisms that last a period of months as well. In addition to their rituals of ablution, prayer, and baptism, the Mandaeans have a very restrictive diet, sort of similar to the Jews and the Muslims. First, they're only permitted to eat meat that was slaughtered in the Mandaean way, similar to how Islam and Judaism has it, except that their Mandaean way includes putting the being in a river and then not letting it touch the ground after the river until they eat it. Second, Mandaeans are prohibited from eating predatory animals, like the Muslims, but they're also prohibited from eating animals that come into contact with the earth. So they mostly eat fish and birds, except for, interestingly, male ram, for reasons that remain unclear to scholars. The restrictions are even more severe for the priestly class in the Mandaean religion. The priestly class are thought to exist in the light world, with God, Al-Hayy, and the Malaika, the angels. And as such, they can only cook in river water and can only drink river water. So now that we profiled the religion a little bit, we know a little bit about its belief systems and rituals. Where do the Mandaeans actually come from? And why haven't we heard of them? There's a disagreement among Western scholars about their origin. Some Western scholars do not believe the Mandaeans' own tale of their origin and believe that they began in the 3rd century AD in Mesopotamia, around where Iraq is now. But other scholars believe their own origin story, which indicates that they are a direct line of followers from the time of John the Baptist until today. Interestingly, Mandaean religious texts contain colophons, which record their scribes in a direct chronological order, beginning with a man named Zaze Ed Gavesta. In the Mandaeans' own religious text, the Haran Goethe, they believe that they originated in Jerusalem at the time of John the Baptist as Jews, and that they fled Jewish persecution, the kind of Jewish persecution, by the way, that killed Jesus Christ, in around 30 to 33 AD. So around the time of the death of Jesus Christ, and that they moved from Jerusalem to Mesopotamia, where their first scribe, Zaze Ed Gavetsa, was recorded in their literature. Upon the Islamic conquest of Iraq some 3 centuries later, the Mandaeans were ruled by a man named Anus Bardanqa. Anus Bardanqa convinced the Muslims, and particularly the Muslim governors, that his people were the people named in the Quran as As-Sabi'ah. The Quran is the religious text of the Muslims. The Islamic religion makes particular accommodations for what it considers people of the book, which are Christians, Jews, and the Sabi'ah, a mysterious people. The Sabi'ah were thought to be the Mandaeans, and therefore were afforded special accommodations under Islamic law. So for the last 14 centuries, Mandaeans have lived under Muslim rule. But many Muslims have never heard of them. The reason why is because their religion requires them to be in close proximity to rivers. Otherwise, they can't perform ablution, baptisms, their priests can't even eat. So therefore, they've mostly lived around the 2 rivers of Iraq and the Karun River in Iran, in a place called Khuzestan specifically. Though the Mandaeans have tried to live a peaceful existence, they have come into conflict with both Christians and Muslims. For example, in the 14th century, that's the 1300s, Mandaeans came into a conflict with Muslims that is allegedly over a Muslim kidnapping of a Mandaean girl. and it led to a war between them that left the Mandaeans without a priestly class for years. In the 16th century, the Portuguese, who are a particularly violent colonial empire, forced the Mandaeans of Basra in modern-day Iraq to attend church services. And again in 1839, the Mandaeans were violently compelled to circumcise themselves under a Bedouin leader named Thamar bin Qatban. It's interesting that we return to the subject of circumcision, which is the original subject that got us into all these historical videos. Only 7 years before this forced circumcision, in 1831, the Mandaeans encountered something even more devastating. It was a cholera outbreak called the Plague of Sustar that killed nearly half of the Mandaean community and its entire priestly class. This put the Mandaeans in a very difficult position. You see, the Mandaean religion is dependent on the priestly class, and the priestly class is hereditary, and the Mandaeans believed strictly that only priests could initiate other priests. Since they had no priests at the time, they were left without an option. So they had some of the Mandaeans, by the way, the Mandaeans who speak Mandaic fluently are called Ayalupas. They had some of these Ayalupas prepare two people, and then these two people, who were relatives of the priests, initiated each other at once. The Mandaeans then lived in a relatively unremarkable period from the middle 1800s until the late 1900s, when the Islamic Revolution of Iran took them by surprise. The new Islamic government of Iran did not recognize them as people of the book, the Sabaean, that they claimed to be originally in the Quran. So the Islamic government of Iran didn't allow the Mandaeans to study into higher education, to work in the public sector. They even were forbidden from naming their children Mandaean names, which presented a particular problem for the Mandaean community. As you'll see later on, Mandaean names are particularly important and form sort of a gate of entry into the Mandaean community. Thankfully, this situation reversed itself in Iran in the early 2000s when a man named Ayatollah Khamenei took over in Iran and declared them a people of the book. But then it got much worse with the invasion of Iraq. The combination of their persecution in Iran over the last several decades and the carnage in Iraq led to a worldwide diaspora of Mandaeans. Today, there are thought to be only 50,000 remaining Mandaeans in the Middle East, 30,000 in Iraq, 20,000 in Iran, whereas the rest of the 40% of their community exists in the West. This has led some Mandaeans to fear the extinction of their religion, as many in the diaspora in Europe and North America don't have access to river water. So some Mandaean priests have issued edicts allowing running tap water to be used as if it's river water. But this still leaves the diaspora with another problem, which is that the Mandaean community practices total endogamy. They only marry from within their religion, and on the penalty of excommunication, by the way. And the community living abroad has less access to Mandaeans. There are two more things I want to talk about. One is the fact that the Mandaean religion is really an ethno-religious community, and the second is their genetics. First of all, for all of recorded history, Mandaeans have not preached their religion to other people. They do not what's called proselytize. They don't even accept converts. And moreover, as I just mentioned, they only marry from within the religion, practicing total endogamy. In fact, conversion to the Mandaean religion is completely impossible because Mandaeans do not baptize someone who wasn't born with what's called a malwasa. A malwasa is only given at birth. It's a Mandaic name that's from their own language, but chosen according to the person's mother's name, and the mother must be Mandaean for that to happen, and according to the Mandaean zodiac. Interestingly, maybe due to their persecution or common history, the Mandaeans share a lot of similarities with the Jewish community. For example, their focus on ritual as opposed to spirituality, which is true for most of the Jewish sects except for the Hasidic community and a couple of others. Their focus on purity, their focus on community, their refusal to accept converts, and even their matrilineal naming system, which is rare among Semites. It's only found among the Mandaeans, the Jews, and a couple of Semitic populations in Oman, which are little known and which I'll make a video on later. Today, most Mandaeans speak either Arabic or Persian as their first language. The Mandaic language is spoken almost exclusively by the priestly class. The Mandaic language is most similar to the Aramaic language spoken by some Syrian and Iraqi Christians. It's also a cousin, of course, of Arabic and Hebrew, but I believe it's much closer, in my opinion, to the Arabic language. Now, before we end, I want to answer a question. Are the Mandaeans really the descendants of the Jews from around the time of Jesus Christ? Or do they descend from a different Mesopotamian population around Iran and Iraq? Well, I think we can answer this question because the Mandaeans practice such an extreme form of endogamy that they should have maintained their genetics in some way since back then. Now, there are no published studies on the genetics of the Mandaeans, but because I've been involved in this field for so long and looked at so many different people's genetics from my region over time, I have come across some Mandaean. And let me tell you what I discovered about them. Now, I've come across 3 Mandaean genetic profiles. I prefer, as you guys have begun to notice probably, Y DNA from the father's side. Although in reality, if someone was studying the Mandaeans, they'd really want to know about their matrilineal DNA as well, because their naming convention goes from the matrilineal side. But anyway, I'm more familiar with Y DNA. And what I discovered was 2 of them belonged to the Y DNA haplogroup JM172, and 1 belonged to the Y DNA haplogroup EM215. Moreover, one of these samples from Iraq had a statistical analysis done of his STRs compared to representative populations from the Ashkenazi Jews and the Mizrahi Jews, those are the Middle Eastern Jews. He shared about 30% of his DNA with them, consistent with the Mandaean origin story. So there you have it, friends. A Semitic people you've probably never heard of, following somebody that is a household name, John the Baptist. It's interesting how the cult of Jesus exploded while the cult of John remained an archaic cult that still exists till today, so few in number. There are other Semitic peoples in the Middle East that most of you probably don't know about. So for example, did you know that Samaritans still exist? You probably heard the phrase a good Samaritan before, but did you know that this community has existed continuously since the time of Jesus Christ and considers itself to be the true Jewish community? Or for example, there are several populations in Oman that speak a Semitic language that isn't Arabic, isn't Hebrew, isn't Aramaic, and is as old as those languages too. So let me know if you'd like me to make a video about some of these populations next. I wish you a great day and I hope to see you again tomorrow.